I never imagined that the happiest day of my professional life would quietly turn into the most devastating moment of my personal life. For 30 long years, I had given everything to one company: early mornings, late nights, missed birthdays, canceled vacations. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I was finally handed the envelope that morning. The retirement package I had worked my entire adult life to earn. What I didn't know was that within a few hours, I would overhear a conversation that would change how I saw my marriage forever. Before I continue, please like and subscribe, but only if the story truly resonates with you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? That morning, I walked out of my office carrying more than just paperwork. I carried pride, relief, a strange sense of disbelief that it was finally over. My supervisor shook my hand and told me I had earned every dollar. My coworkers clapped, joked, and teased me about finally enjoying life. Someone handed me a small plaque. Another gave me a gold watch. I smiled through it all, already planning the surprise waiting at home. I left work early, nearly 2 hours ahead of schedule. My wife wasn't expecting me. I imagined her reaction when I told her that we were set for life, that the long years of stress were finally behind us. I rehearsed the moment in my head as I drove. Her smile, the hug, maybe even tears. When I opened the front door of our house, everything looked the same. The familiar hallway, the framed photos lining the wall, the staircase made of dark oak that we'd posed on for Christmas pictures for decades. I set my briefcase down quietly. Then I heard her voice. It was coming from upstairs. She was on the phone. At first, I didn't pay attention. I took off my shoes, loosened my tie, and took a step toward the stairs. That's when her words stopped me cold. She sounded calm, confident, almost excited. "Don't worry," she said. "Once everything is finalized, I'll get at least half. Maybe more if his lawyer isn't sharp." My chest tightened. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping me upright. She kept talking, unaware that I was home, unaware that every word was carving something deep inside me. She wasn't talking about a vacation. She wasn't talking about a house upgrade. She was talking about divorce, about dividing assets, about my retirement. I didn't confront her. I didn't make a sound. I picked up my briefcase, walked back out the door, and got into my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to sit there for a full minute before I could even turn the key. I drove to a small coffee shop a few miles away and sat there replaying every moment of the last year of my marriage, wondering how long this had been planned, and how close I'd come to losing everything without ever knowing it. I sat in that coffee shop for nearly an hour, staring at the same untouched cup, watching people come and go like nothing in the world had shifted. My phone buzzed twice. Messages from my wife. Casual ones. "Where are you?" Followed by, "Everything okay?" The normal tone of them almost hurt more than what I had overheard. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to speak, because if I did, I wasn't sure I could keep my voice steady. Eventually, I drove back home, but I didn't go inside right away. I stayed in the car, parked across the street, looking at the house I had paid for, repaired, and protected for decades. Every brick felt heavier now, like it carried a secret I had just uncovered. I kept thinking about her words. Not emotional, not angry, strategic, as if my life had become a transaction. She was calmly calculating. When I finally walked in, she was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, humming softly like it was any other afternoon. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, then paused. "You're home early," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "They let me go early today." She wiped her hands on a towel and came over to hug me. I stood there stiffly, my arms barely moving. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to. "How did it go?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Really good." Her eyes lit up for just a second, and that moment told me everything. She was waiting for confirmation, for numbers, for details she could plug into whatever plan she had already made. We sat down to eat. I watched her closely, every smile, every casual question suddenly feeling rehearsed. She asked about the office, about my co-workers, about what I planned to do next. I answered carefully, keeping my tone neutral. I didn't mention the package. I didn't mention the amount. I didn't mention retirement. Halfway through dinner, she casually said, "You know, a lot of couples struggle after retirement. Being around each other all the time changes things." I nodded. "I've heard that." She took a sip of water and added, "Some people even realize they want different things at this stage." I looked at her then. Really looked. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hesitant. She was testing the ground, seeing how much she could say without raising suspicion. Later that night, after she went to bed, I stayed up alone in the living room. I opened old photo albums, vacations, anniversaries, smiling faces that now felt distant. I wondered when we stopped being partners and started becoming opponents. That night, I made a decision I never thought I would have to make. I wouldn't confront her yet. I wouldn't give her a reason to speed things up or change her strategy. I needed to understand how deep this went, how long she'd been preparing, and what she thought she was entitled to if she was planning a divorce. Then I needed to start planning too. Quietly, the next few days felt like a performance I was forced to act in without rehearsal. I woke up beside her, drank coffee with her, and listened to her talk about errands and appointments while my mind stayed locked on that single phone call I had overheard. Every small interaction felt layered now, like there was a meaning beneath the meaning. I started noticing things I had ignored before. How often she stepped out to take calls. How she angled her phone away from me. How carefully she chose her words whenever finances came up. I decided to test something small. One afternoon, while we were folding laundry together, I casually mentioned that a former coworker had lost a big chunk of his retirement during a messy divorce. I watched her closely as I spoke, pretending to focus on the towels in my hands. "That's terrible," she said quickly. "Divorce can ruin people financially." Her voice stayed steady, but her hands paused for just a second before she resumed folding. It was subtle, but was there. A hesitation she didn't realize she had revealed. That pause told me she was already imagining outcomes, calculating risk, measuring gain. That evening, I began quietly reviewing our finances. I didn't take anything. I didn't move any money. I just looked. Accounts, statements, documents I hadn't checked in years, because I trusted her completely. What I found wasn't illegal, but it was unsettling. She had been far more involved in the details than I realized. She knew where everything was, how it was structured, what could be touched and what couldn't. I also noticed something else. She had stopped making long-term plans. No more talk about future trips. No more discussions about renovating the guest room. When I brought up ideas about retirement life, she responded vaguely or changed the subject. It was as if she was already imagining a future that didn't include me. A few nights later, she asked me something that almost made me laugh in disbelief. "So," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "have you thought about what you'd do if things changed?" "Changed how?" I asked. She shrugged. "You know, if life didn't look the way we expected." I looked at her and saw it clearly then. This wasn't curiosity. It was preparation. She wanted to know how I would react to loss, to instability, to separation. She wanted to see if I would panic, if I would cling, if I would bargain. "I'd adapt," I said simply. "I always have." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night, lying awake in bed, I realized something painful but important. The woman beside me wasn't plotting out of anger or heartbreak. She was planning out of confidence. Confidence that I wouldn't see it coming. Confidence that I would be too trusting, too tired, or too slow to protect myself. She thought she had time. She didn't know that I was already 2 steps ahead. I started paying closer attention to timing. Not just what she said, but when she said it. Conversations about money only happened when we were relaxed, when dinner was done, when I was distracted. Questions came wrapped in concern, not curiosity. She never asked directly. She circled topics, letting me fill in gaps she didn't want to ask about outright. One morning, she mentioned an old friend who had recently separated. "They're still being civil," she said while pouring coffee. "They agreed not to involve lawyers at first, just to keep things fair." I looked up from the paper. "That's rare," She nodded, but it saved them a lot of stress. And money. There was again the gentle suggestion, the framing of fairness as speed, of trust as efficiency. I simply said, depends on who's defining fair. She didn't respond. She just smiled and changed the subject. That afternoon, I made my first real move. I scheduled a consultation with a financial advisor I had worked with years ago. I told my wife I was meeting an old colleague. It wasn't even a lie. The meeting wasn't about divorce yet. It was about understanding exposure, risk, what could be protected, and what couldn't if things went the way I now suspected they would. The advisor listened quietly as I explained the situation, carefully leaving out names. When I finished, he leaned back and said something that stayed with me. People don't start planning at the end, he said. They start planning when they feel secure enough to stop pretending. That sentence felt uncomfortably accurate. He helped me map timelines, retirement dates, asset classifications, what changed before and after retirement paperwork was finalized. I didn't alter anything. I just learned. Knowledge at that point was my only defense. When I got home, she was unusually attentive. She asked how my day went. She suggested we watch a movie together. She even brought up an old memory from early in our marriage, laughing like she was reminding me who she used to be. I realized then that affection had become another tool, not fake, just strategically placed. Later that night, she casually asked, "Do you ever worry about being alone?" The question landed heavier than she intended. I think everyone worries about that sometimes. I replied. She nodded, especially at our age. I turned toward her. Is that something you're worried about? She paused and said, I just think people deserve security, emotional and financial. That was the first time she said it out loud. Security, not love, not partnership, security. As I lay awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, I accepted something I had been avoiding. This wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. This was a divergence that had already happened. We were standing in the same house, but we were no longer standing on the same side, and whatever came next would depend on who acted first. By the 5th week after my retirement, the tension in the house had settled into something quiet and controlled. No arguments, no accusations, just a careful distance disguised as normalcy. We still shared meals, still talked about errands, still slept in the same bed. But the warmth that once filled those routines was gone, replaced by caution on both sides. I noticed she had started reorganizing paperwork, not randomly, intentionally. Folders were moved. Old files were pulled out and neatly stacked. Documents I hadn't seen in years suddenly appeared on the dining table under the excuse of decluttering. She wasn't hiding anything. She was making sure she knew where everything was. One afternoon, she asked if I remember where we kept the original deed to the house. I think it's in the safe, I said. She nodded, just wanted to be sure. Later that day, I checked. The deed was still there, but the envelope had been opened. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was just paranoia. I didn't confront her. Instead, I started documenting quietly. I made copies of important records. I stored them somewhere secure, somewhere she wouldn't think to look. I wasn't taking anything away from her. I was making sure nothing could be taken from me without my knowledge. A few nights later, she brought up something new. I've been thinking, she said, sitting across from me on the couch. If we ever did decide to go our separate ways, I'd want it to be amicable. No fighting, no dragging things out. Of course, I replied. No one wants chaos. She smiled, relieved by my response. Exactly. People ruin each other by getting lawyers involved. That word again. Lawyers. She said it like a curse, like a threat disguised as wisdom. I didn't argue. I didn't reassure her either. I simply nodded. What she didn't know was that I had already scheduled a quiet consultation of my own. Not to file anything, not to make a move, just to understand my rights before someone else decided them for me. The attorney didn't dramatize things. He didn't encourage conflict. He asked questions, careful ones, about timing, about intent, about what had been said and what hadn't. When I mentioned the phone call I overheard, his expression changed. That's not casual talk, he said. That's planning. I drove home with a clarity that felt heavy, but grounding. This wasn't about saving a marriage anymore. It was about avoiding a blindside. That evening, she cooked my favorite meal, lit candles, poured wine. It felt like a goodbye disguised as a gesture. As we ate, she reached across the table and touched my hand. "I hope you know," she said softly. "I only want what's fair." I met her eyes and nodded. "So do I." But fairness, I had learned, depends entirely on who defines it first. From that point on, every interaction felt measured. Not cold, not hostile, just calculated. She stopped asking direct questions about money and started speaking in hypotheticals instead. Stories about people she knew, situations she'd heard about, each one carefully designed to test my reactions without revealing her own intentions. One evening, she mentioned a couple who had stayed married only on paper for a while. They waited until everything was settled, she said. Then they filed. Smart, honestly. I looked at her. Smart for who? She hesitated. For both of them. That answer didn't sit right, because in every story she told, one person always seemed more prepared than the other. I kept my responses neutral, short, unemotional. I didn't argue or agree. I learned quickly that silence unsettled her more than resistance ever could. When I stopped feeding the conversation, she had nothing to build on. Meanwhile, I stayed busy. I organized my days carefully. Morning walks, lunch with old colleagues, appointments that kept me out of the house longer than usual. I wasn't avoiding her. I was creating space. Space to think clearly without being influenced. During that time, I reviewed my retirement paperwork again. Slowly, line by line, I paid attention to dates, signatures, clauses that hadn't mattered before, but now felt critical. I realized how close I had been to finalizing everything without question. If I had done that, she would have had exactly what she needed. One afternoon, she surprised me by asking if I wanted to take a short trip together. Just somewhere quiet, she said, before life gets busy. The timing was wrong. Too sudden. Too convenient. Maybe later, I replied, "I've got a few things to sort out first." She smiled, but I could tell she was disappointed. Not because she wanted the trip, but because she wanted what it represented. Normalcy, stability, a sense that nothing was changing. That night, I overheard her on the phone again. Not as clearly as before. Just fragments this time. "He's taking longer than I expected. No, I don't think he suspects. I just need things finalized first." I didn't need to hear more. There was no confusion left. No doubt. No benefit in pretending. The woman I shared a home with was already planning her exit. Carefully. Patiently. With confidence. And the longer I stayed silent, the more confident she became. But silence doesn't mean inaction. It means preparation. I made a decision that night. Not confront her. Not yet. But to stop delaying what I knew had to happen. I scheduled another meeting with my attorney. This time, I brought everything. Documents, notes, timelines. I wasn't filing for divorce. I was making sure that when the moment came, I wouldn't be reacting. I would be ready. The second meeting with my attorney felt different from the first. The first had been about awareness. This one was about readiness. I laid everything out on the table. The retirement paperwork, the financial statements, notes I had quietly kept about conversations, dates, and comments that now formed a clear pattern. He didn't rush me. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, occasionally asking me to clarify a detail or confirm a timeline. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, "You're not imagining this." That sentence alone lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. "She's not acting emotionally," he continued. "She's acting strategically. That means timing matters. And right now, timing favors whoever moves with information instead of impulse." He explained what I could do without escalating things, what I should avoid doing at all costs, which actions might trigger her to accelerate her plans if she sensed resistance. It wasn't about attacking first. It was about not being exposed. I left that office calmer than I had been in weeks. At home, she was cheerful, almost relaxed. She asked if I wanted dessert. suggested we sit outside for a bit since the weather was nice. It felt like she was trying to reset the tone, to smooth over whatever tension she sensed growing beneath the surface. We sat on the patio, the same place we'd spent countless evenings talking about the future. This time, the future felt like a carefully avoided topic. Out of nowhere, she said, "I've been thinking about updating our wills." I kept my face neutral. "Why now?" She shrugged. "It's responsible, especially after retirement." Responsible. That word again. "I suppose," I said. She smiled, satisfied with my noncommittal answer. But inside, I felt the confirmation settle. This wasn't random. This was alignment. Legal, financial, procedural alignment. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind was finally clear. The confusion had burned away, leaving something sharper behind. I knew exactly what was happening. And I knew that the longer I waited without preparing, the more ground I'd lose. The next morning, I did something small but important. I opened a new bank account in my own name, not to move money, not to hide anything, just to establish independence. A simple step, a quiet one, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd handed over. When I got home, she was on the phone again. This time, she ended the call quickly when she saw me. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," she said too quickly. "Just checking on something." I nodded and walked past her, feeling a strange sense of balance return. For the first time since overhearing that call weeks ago, I wasn't reacting to her moves anymore. I was anticipating them, and that changed everything. Once I stopped reacting, the atmosphere in the house shifted again. Not warmer, not colder, sharper. She seemed to sense that something had changed, even if she couldn't name it. Her questions became fewer, but her observations became more precise. She watched more than she spoke, listened longer than usual. It was subtle, but I noticed. One evening, she asked if I wanted to review our monthly expenses together. "We should make sure we're aligned now, that income will look different," she said. I agreed without hesitation. We sat at the dining table with spreadsheets open, receipts laid out neatly between us. I let her lead the conversation. She pointed out categories, suggested adjustments, talked about streamlining. I nodded, added a comment here and there, but mostly I observed. She wasn't worried about budgeting. She was mapping. Every question was a data point. Every reaction, a measurement. She wanted to know how closely I was paying attention, whether I was still trusting, whether I would catch what she didn't want to explain. At one point, she said, "It's comforting to know we're still on the same page." I looked up. "Are we?" The question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't accusatory. It was calm. She blinked, caught off guard. "Of course," she said quickly. "Why wouldn't we be?" I let the moment pass. Just checking. That night, she stayed up later than usual. I heard drawers opening, papers being shuffled. When she finally came to bed, she lay stiffly on her side, facing away from me. The next day, I received an email from my attorney. Nothing urgent, just a short message confirming that all my documents were in order and reminding me not to sign or agree to anything without review. I replied with a simple thank you. That afternoon, she mentioned a neighbor who had recently gone through a very smooth separation. "They worked it out themselves," she said. "No drama. No surprises." I smiled faintly. "That's rare." "It happens when people are honest with each other," she replied. Honest. I almost laughed. Later that evening, she asked me directly for the first time, "You're not hiding anything from me, are you?" I met her gaze. "No. Are you?" There was a pause. Just long enough. "Of course not," she said. But the confidence that once carried her voice was gone, replaced by something thinner. Uncertain. That was when I knew the balance had shifted. She no longer assumed control. She was checking for it. And people only do that when they're no longer sure they have the advantage. I went to bed that night, knowing something important. Whatever move came next, it wouldn't be hers alone. The following week unfolded quietly, but the tension underneath everything grew heavier. She became careful in a way that felt new. Not cautious, calculated. She double-checked doors before leaving. She cleared browser tabs when she heard footsteps. Small habits that didn't mean much on their own, but together painted a clear picture. She knew the advantage was slipping. One afternoon, she suggested we sit down and have an honest conversation. Those were her exact words. We sat across from each other in the living room, the same room where we had celebrated anniversaries and birthdays for decades. Now it felt like neutral territory. Neither of us leaned back. Neither of us smiled. "I feel like we've been distant," she said. "Like we're both holding something back." I nodded slowly. That happens when trust changes. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Has it?" "Yes," I said. "It has." She took a breath, clearly choosing her words. "If there's something you're worried about, we should talk about it before misunderstandings turn into damage." Damage. The word landed exactly where she wanted it to. "I agree," I said calmly. "But honesty goes both ways." She shifted in her seat. "Of course." I waited. She didn't continue. That silence told me she wasn't ready to admit anything. She wanted me to go first, to expose my hand, to react emotionally so she could recalibrate. I didn't. Instead, I said, "I think it's important that neither of us makes assumptions about the future." Her expression tightened for a split second. "What does that mean?" "It means we should be careful." I replied, "About plans, about expectations." She forced a small smile. I thought that's what I was saying. "No," I said gently. "You were talking about control. I'm talking about clarity." The conversation ended shortly after that, not with anger, but with unease. We both stood up knowing nothing had been resolved, and that was intentional on my part. That night, she made a phone call she thought I couldn't hear. She whispered this time. "I don't know," she said. "He's different. He's not reacting like he used to." A pause. "Yes, I know. That's what worries me." I didn't need to hear the rest. The next morning, she left early without saying goodbye. When I checked the calendar later, I noticed something new added. A meeting. No details. Just a block of time marked personal. I smiled to myself, because I had already scheduled my own meeting for that same afternoon. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to move. I met with my attorney and signed documents I had hoped I'd never need. Not filings, preparations, safeguards, clear lines drawn quietly and legally. By the time I returned home, I felt steady. She arrived later than usual. Her smile was practiced, her questions vague. She asked about my day. "Productive?" I said. She nodded. "Mine, too." For the first time, that answer felt like a lie on both sides. And for the first time, I knew exactly where this was heading. By the time we reached that point, the house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a waiting room. We moved around each other politely, carefully avoiding conflict while quietly preparing for it. Conversations became shorter. Plans became vague. Even simple questions carried weight, as if every word might be remembered later. A few days after our tense talk, she suggested we meet with a mediator. "Just explore options," she said. "No commitments." The phrasing was careful, non-threatening, reasonable. "I'll think about it," I replied. She nodded, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. This wasn't about mediation. It was about pace. She wanted to control how fast things moved when information surfaced and who reacted first. That evening, I received an email from my attorney confirming that certain protections were now active. Nothing dramatic, just legal boundaries quietly put in place. Lines that couldn't be crossed without consequence. I didn't feel relief. I felt resolve. The next morning, she brought up something unexpected. "I spoke to my sister," she said while making breakfast. "She thinks we should prioritize fairness over emotion." I looked at her. Fairness according to whom? She paused. "According to what we both contributed." "That's a conversation worth having," I said, "when both people are honest." Her jaw tightened slightly. Later that day, she asked if I planned to tell anyone about what we were going through. "No," I said. "I don't see a reason to." She seemed relieved. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't keeping quiet out of fear. I was staying silent because I didn't need validation. I didn't need allies. I needed precision. That night, she packed a small bag and said she'd be staying with a friend for a few days. Just to clear my head, she explained. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I helped her carry the bag to the car. As she stood in the driveway, keys in hand, she hesitated. I never wanted things to feel like this, she said softly. I believe you, I replied, but intention doesn't change outcome. She looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for something familiar. Then she nodded and got into the car. When the taillights disappeared down the street, the house felt different. Not empty. Honest. I walked back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and reviewed my notes one last time. Everything was in place. Every step taken quietly, deliberately, without escalation. For the first time since my retirement, I wasn't reacting to uncertainty anymore. I was prepared for it. And I knew the next move, whatever it was, would finally bring everything into the open. The day she was gone passed more slowly than I expected. Not because I missed her presence, but because the silence forced everything into focus. Without the careful conversations and measured glances, there was nothing to distract me from what was coming. The house felt larger, clearer, like a stage after the actors have stepped away, waiting for the final scene. On the third day, she called. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed. I think we need to be realistic, she said. This space has helped me see things more clearly. I agree, I replied. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear her recalibrating. She hadn't expected agreement so quickly. I don't want this to turn into something ugly, she continued. We've both worked too hard for that. I don't want that either, I said, which is why clarity matters now more than comfort. She exhaled softly. I've spoken to someone. Just to understand my options. I assumed you had, I said. That honesty caught her off guard. You did. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Well, she said carefully, then you understand why timing is important. I do, I replied. That's why I've been careful too. The word too hung between us. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. The dynamic had shifted again, and she knew it. The confidence she once carried was gone, replaced by caution. We ended the call without resolution, but with something more important, acknowledgement. That evening, I sat alone at the dining table and reviewed everything one last time, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain there were no gaps, no assumptions, no loose ends. Every decision I had made was deliberate, every delay intentional. When she came back 2 days later, she didn't bring much, just a suitcase and a quiet expression. I think we should talk, she said. We will, I replied, but not tonight. She looked surprised. Why not? Because tonight isn't about fixing things, I said calmly. It's about understanding them, and that takes time. She nodded slowly. We slept in separate rooms for the first time that night, not out of anger, out of acceptance. The house felt balanced again, not because things were resolved, but because the pretending had stopped. The next morning, she asked if I had considered mediation again. I have, I said, and I've also considered what happens if it doesn't work. She swallowed. So you're prepared for either outcome? Yes, I replied. Are you? She didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than words ever could. Whatever came next wouldn't be a surprise. It wouldn't be rushed, and it wouldn't be one-sided, because for the first time in a long time, we were both standing in the truth. The conversation we had 2 days later was the one I had been preparing for all along. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No food between us this time. No distractions. No pretense of normalcy. The air felt heavy, but not hostile. It felt inevitable. I think we both know where this is heading, she said. I nodded. I think we've known for a while. We just avoided saying it out loud. She folded her hands together. I don't want this to be a fight. Neither do I said, but I also don't want it to be rushed or manipulated. Her eyes flickered at that word. Manipulated? Yes, I replied calmly. Decisions made quietly. Plans discussed with other people. Conversations I wasn't meant to hear. That changes how trust works. She looked down at the table. For the first time, She didn't deny it. "I didn't think you'd hear that call," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. That's why it mattered. There it was. The admission. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just honest. She took a slow breath. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect myself." "I understand that," I said, "but protection shouldn't come at the cost of deception." We talked for over an hour. About the marriage. About how things had shifted long before my retirement. About fear. About control. About how easily love turns into strategy when people stop talking honestly. When we finally discussed separation directly, it felt strangely calm. No raised voices. No accusations. Just two people acknowledging that the partnership had ended long before either of us wanted to admit it. We agreed to try mediation first, not because either of us believed it would fix things, but because it would give structure to the process, boundaries, timelines, accountability. As we talked through logistics, I noticed something important. She wasn't leading anymore. She was participating, and that difference mattered. Later that evening, after the conversation ended, I sat alone in the living room, the same room where I had once imagined celebrating my retirement with her. The same couch, the same walls. Everything looked unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. I didn't feel anger. I felt closure beginning to form, not the kind that comes with answers, but the kind that comes with clarity. That night, I slept better than I had in months, not because the future was certain, but because the truth no longer had to hide. Mediation began the following week exactly the way I expected it would. Structured, polite, controlled. We sat in a neutral office with a mediator who spoke calmly and took notes as if this were just another case file, not the quiet dismantling of a life built over decades. My wife arrived prepared, folders neatly organized, posture confident. I arrived prepared too, but in a different way. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to make sure nothing slipped past unnoticed. The mediator asked us to explain what we wanted. My wife spoke first. She talked about fairness, about wanting stability, about how people change after retirement, and how that shift can expose differences that were always there. Her words were smooth, carefully chosen, as if she had practiced them. When it was my turn, I didn't talk about feelings. I talked about facts. I explained the timeline, the retirement paperwork, the contributions made over the years. I spoke about transparency and how trust erodes when plans are discussed in secret. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I simply laid everything out calmly and clearly. The mediator listened closely. As the conversation moved into specifics, I noticed something shift. Questions that had been general became precise. Requests for clarification started coming more often from my wife than from me. She asked for breaks to review notes. She double-checked numbers she had clearly assumed were settled. At one point, the mediator asked a simple question. When did discussions about separation first begin? There was a pause. My wife hesitated, then said, "Sometime after retirement." I didn't interrupt. The mediator turned to me. "Is that your understanding as well?" "No," I said evenly. "They began before." Silence filled the room. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. The documentation did that for me. Dates, records, timelines, everything aligned. For the first time since this process began, I saw uncertainty replace confidence on her face. The session ended without resolution, but with something more important established. Context. Outside, she stopped me before we reached our cars. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" I asked. "Make it sound like I was planning behind your back." "I didn't make it sound like anything," I replied. "I described what happened." She looked away. That drive home felt different. Lighter, not because anything was finished, but because the truth was finally visible to someone other than me. That night, I sat alone and reflected on how close I had come to losing control simply by trusting the wrong moment. If I hadn't overheard that call, if I had finalized everything without question, if I had assumed loyalty where there was strategy, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt gratitude, not for the outcome, which was still unfolding, but for the clarity that had arrived in time. Whatever came next, It would no longer be decided in whispers or assumptions. It would be decided in the open. The second mediation session took place 2 weeks later, and the difference was immediate. There was no small talk this time, no easing into the conversation. Everyone arrived knowing exactly what was at stake. The mediator opened by summarizing what had been established in the first session, carefully emphasizing timelines and disclosures. Hearing everything laid out that way removed any remaining ambiguity. This wasn't about emotions anymore. It was about accountability. My wife spoke less this time. When she did, her words were cautious, stripped of the confidence she once carried so easily. She asked more questions than she answered, clarified points she had previously assumed were settled. It was clear she had realized something important after the last session. Preparation only works when the other person stays unprepared. That advantage was gone. As we moved into financial specifics, the mediator reviewed retirement assets in detail. What was earned before, what was earned after, what could be considered shared and what could not. Each category was addressed slowly, deliberately, with no room for interpretation. I watched my wife's posture change as the session went on, shoulders stiffening, hands tightening around her pen. She wasn't losing control, but she was losing certainty, and certainty had been the foundation of her entire strategy. At one point, she said, "I just assumed we would handle this informally." The mediator looked up. Informal arrangements only work when both parties have equal information. No one argued that point. By the end of the session, a framework had been established. Not a final agreement, but a clear direction. The house would be sold. Assets would be divided according to documented contribution and timing. No shortcuts. No verbal promises. Everything would be written, reviewed, and verified. When we stepped outside afterward, she didn't stop me this time. She didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She didn't explain. She simply said, "I didn't think it would go like this." I nodded. Neither did I. That was the most honest exchange we'd had in months. At home that evening, the house felt different again. Not tense, not heavy, just temporary, like a place already preparing to let go of its history. I walked through each room slowly, noticing details I had ignored for years. The worn edge of the dining table, the faded spot on the carpet near the couch, small signs of life lived, now winding down. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of what I was losing. I was relieved about what I was no longer carrying. The next phase was inevitable. Paperwork, signatures, final numbers. None of it would be easy, but it would be clear. And clarity, I had learned, was worth more than comfort. Whatever happened next, it would no longer happen quietly. The final paperwork took longer than I expected, but not for the reasons I feared. There were no sudden demands, no last-minute surprises, no attempts to renegotiate what had already been established. Everything moved slowly, methodically, exactly the way things move when there's nothing left to argue about. The house sold within a month. Watching strangers walk through the rooms we once called home felt surreal, but not painful. By then, the emotional separation had already happened. This was just logistics catching up to reality. When the sale closed, the numbers matched what had been documented all along. Contributions were acknowledged, timelines respected. The retirement package I had spent decades earning was protected exactly as it should have been. No drama, no courtroom, no public fallout, just facts doing what facts do. The day we signed the final agreement, we sat across from each other one last time. There was no hostility left between us, just distance. A quiet understanding that what we had was no longer recoverable and hadn't been for a long time. She looked tired, not defeated, just worn down by the realization that control doesn't guarantee outcome. "I never meant for it to turn into this," she said softly. "I know," I replied, "but intentions don't change patterns." She nodded, accepting that without argument. When it was over, I walked out alone into the parking lot and sat in my car for a moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. What I felt was steady. For the first time since my retirement, my future felt like it belonged to me again. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. Mornings were quiet. Days were unstructured. I reconnected with old friends, took walks without checking the time, rediscovered parts of myself I had set aside while carrying responsibilities that no longer existed. I thought often about how close I had come to losing everything simply by trusting the wrong moment, how one overheard conversation had changed the course of my life, and how preparation, not anger, had made the difference. If I had confronted her immediately, emotions would have taken over. If I had rushed decisions, I would have paid for it. If I had stayed silent without acting, I would have been unprotected. Instead, I waited. I learned. I prepared. That didn't save the marriage, but it saved me. And sometimes, that's the only outcome that truly matters.